This week on SnarkSquad Pod, we are joined by Sari Riley and Sam from Thoughts on Tomes to discuss Netflix's The Umbrella Academy. Welcome back to SnarkSquad Pod. I'm Nicole Sweeney.
My name is Marines, and today we're joined by Sari and Sam.
Hi, I'm Sari. I work on the YouTube channel Crash Course with Nicole. I am an editorial assistant for the comic Monstrous, and I'm on the podcast SciShow Tangents.
Hi, I'm Sam from Thoughts on Tomes, which is my YouTube channel where I review books and sometimes talk about other media. And Mari and I co-founded BookNet Fest, which is a book festival that also sometimes mentions other media that is happening in September of this year for our third year in a row.
Originally, when we decided to cover this, I kind of pushed it because I saw that it was coming out on Netflix and the trailer looked good, and it's based on a graphic novel series, so of course we thought, okay, we'll invite Sari. And then I was having feelings about it on Twitter, and Sam was like, so you're gonna invite me, right?
Okay, that was a really polite way of putting it. Like, I basically demanded to be on it. Like, I bullied my way here, and I'm very happy to be here.
I sent Nicole a message. I was like, do you see what's happening on Twitter right now? But we're very happy to have you both to talk about the Umbrella Academy today. And I've got the amazing job of trying to do a plot synopsis. This is like the third time in a row I've had a very convoluted and unwieldy thing to synopsisize. So here we go. In 1989, 43 women gave birth to children at the very same time, even though none of them were pregnant prior to that moment. A billionaire, aka the plight of all nations, named Reginald Hargreaves decides that he wants to adopt a bunch of these babies, and he manages to get 7 of them. And he numbers them instead of names them because that's the kind of douche that he is, until their robot mother and caretaker gives them names. The children develop abilities, so Reginald forms a superhero squad called the Umbrella Academy. Number 1 is Luther, and he is super strong, but also he's injected with a serum that's supposed to save his life and ends up turning him into like a half gorilla kind of thing. He is the last sibling to leave the house when the family starts getting estranged, and he ends up going to the moon for a secret mission. Number 2 is Diego, and he's really good at throwing knives. In the present, he is acting as a vigilante. Number 3 is Allison, and she can make anyone believe or do anything she says if she starts a sentence with, I heard a rumor. She's a famous actress, and she's going through a divorce in which she has lost custody of her child. Number 4 is Klaus, and he sees dead people and is a drug addict. Number 5 can jump through space and time, and he has been missing since they were children. Number 6 is Ben, and he is dead, though we later learn that he can release monsters or tentacles of some sort through his stomach. Number 7 is Vanya, and she is raised to believe that she is powerless. She's kept apart from the rest of her family, and when she grows up, she writes a revealing memoir, and she currently is playing the violin professionally. So Reginald dies, and all of the estranged brothers and sisters come together for his funeral. While they're scattering his ashes, a portal opens up, and number 5 returns from the future with the terrible news that the world is going to end in 8 days. No one really pays attention to him because of reasons, so he goes about trying to figure out how the world ends and how he can stop it. And he's running from 2 assassins that are sent by his former employer, and he's basically just a really pissed off old man in a child's body. Luther thinks for a hot second that maybe somebody killed their dad, but Klaus talks to their dad and finds out that Reginald actually committed suicide in order to get the gang back together, and Luther spends the majority of his time flirting with his sister, Allison, and trying to be a leader primarily by reminding everybody that he is the leader. Diego has an ex-girlfriend named Patch who is a cop, and he spends a lot of his time giving her speeches about how wrong she is for following, the law. And when Klaus is kidnapped by time-jumping assassins, Patch decides to try things vigilante style and promptly is murdered, adding to Diego's pain. Vanya meets a guy and starts to fall in love with him, but Allison doesn't trust him since she found him breaking into her apartment. Vanya won't listen, so Allison spends her time trying to look after Vanya, researching the shady new boyfriend named Leonard, and kissing her brother Luther. Klaus has been taking drugs since he was a teen because it helps him keep the dead people at at bay. After he's kidnapped, he escapes with a time-jumping assassin's time-jumping briefcase, and he accidentally sends himself back to the Vietnam War, where he spends a year, falls in love with a man, only to have his love die before he comes back to the present, sober, but with some form of PTSD. Klaus struggles with his sobriety, but the longer he keeps it up, the better hold he has on his powers, from talking to his dead dad to manifesting dead people like Ben into physical bodies. Leonard ends up stealing Vanya's medicine, and so we discover that this medicine has actually been keeping the powers that she does have under control. So her power is to manipulate sound waves, and Leonard manipulates her a ton and poisons her against her family, so that when Allison finds Vanya and tries to share the news that Leonard isn't who he says he is, Vanya slits her throat. The other siblings figure out that Vanya is actually what causes the end of the world, her unleashed powers. They all go to the concert where she is playing, and they think they stop the end of the world when Allison shoots her violin, but there's like an energy blast that goes to the moon, and it explodes and sends meteors to Earth. Before they are killed and before the very end, Five tells them all to hold hands, and he time jumps them somewhere, and that's the end of the first season.
Wow. Cool. All right. So I feel like we all maybe need a breather after that plot synopsis, but we're not gonna get that. We're gonna go on with the podcast and start where we always start. Sam, did you like this?
Why are you targeting me already? Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, it's why you're here. So
okay. So I just want to defend myself a little bit because I like it, but I also am mad that I like it because there's so many problems and it makes me angry. So I like it in the way that I'm emotionally attached to it, and I got very emotionally attached to it very quickly. I didn't know anything about the show before it came out, and then again, Tumblr.com, I just happened to be scrolling innocently and just saw some gift sets of it, and I was like, this thing looks cool, and then I kept seeing things, and then finally I just decided to give in and binge watch it over the course of 2 days. So the first 3 episodes for me were totally great. I'm really invested. I'm crying a ton. This is a great emotional release for me. Awesome. And then episode 4 hit, and I was like, wow, all these tropes I hate are happening at the same time, and that continued to happen, but I was already emotionally invested. So I like the thing, but I also like discussing the problems the thing has, which is why I'm here. Yay.
Oh man, I feel bad for anybody who really loved this show. We just lost them. Sari, how did you feel about this thing? I actually don't know for sure the answer to this question.
I would say I'm probably in between Sam and both of you. There was no point where I wanted to stop watching. I was invested enough to want to keep watching episodes after another. I really liked Klaus and was most invested in him and Ben and resolving their storyline. So that is something that I liked about the show. But I think I started getting uncomfortable around episode 2.
Oops, I must have missed some stuff.
Yeah. And I think part of it was supposed to be intentional, foreshadowing that Leonard was a shitty dude that you could see as an audience member, but maybe Vanya didn't see. And I think some of it was unintentional, just the weirdness of the universe playing out in sort of misogynistic ways, or just ways that felt unsettled me a little bit, whether or not they were actually actively bad or not. And then as I kept watching the show, I think my list of things that make me feel gross about it started growing. And so maybe looking back on those early episodes, I've added things to the list that were maybe more harmless. So overall, I am not sad that I watched it, and I would be interested in a spin-off series just about Ben.
Ben, right? Yes.
But
yes.
Otherwise uninterested in Umbrella Academy season 2. If it comes out, I would watch it to make content, but I would not probably seek it out by myself.
I didn't like it. I thought it had a really strong start in the pilot, and I was prepared to like it because, again, as I said, I was the one who kind of kept suggesting it and pushing it because I thought it looked very interesting. All of those tropes that I hated, that Sam mentioned, a lot of tropes that I don't personally like that stuff outweighed any of the good stuff, and I didn't find a character that I could necessarily attach to emotionally. A lot lot of them just annoyed me, and a lot of the inconsistencies with the tone and the plot, all of that stuff just outweighed any of the okay stuff. And it got to a point where I did want to stop watching. I think it was episode 5 where we do the first like time reset with 5, where things were actually happening, and like I was like, oh yeah, somebody found something out, and then it's like rewind. I was like, fuck this show, I can't. Like that was the point where I really wanted to quit. But you know, content, I soldiered on, and I'm a Sari. I would watch season 2 for content, but I'm not sure. I'm at the point that maybe I would seek it out, like as a hate watching thing, but not for pleasure.
I would watch the second season of this show, and not even as a hate watching, like because I am genuinely curious where it's gonna go. Like I think so. You probably hated it most of all. I also did not particularly like it. I wanted so badly to like this, and the pilot, as everyone else has already articulated, like it set a tone that I was so hyped for. I think there are a lot of really interesting aesthetic things about this show. Like normally, I think when I don't like something and other people do, there's this sense of frustration and confusion. In this case, I understand what it is that is like appealing about this show. I understand like why someone would like it, but there were some storytelling things that were just so infuriating that I am like the whole thing is built on people not talking to each other or listening to each other at any point. The only like narrative moment where people are having conversations is, as Mari said, that one bit right before we do a big plot, like, and then it gets erased. Like that one time that like people like learned things from each other and like talk to each other and use their fucking words, we then reset it, and like that process was like what, just I don't know, like that for me is something that I just find deeply frustrating. It was like painful to watch, and I didn't care about any of these people. Ben was by far my favorite character, and he's dead, so that was disappointing. Like Klaus by extension was my favorite one because Klaus carried Ben around with him, so like like sure, but I don't know, I wanted to like this. I could not bring myself to care about any of these characters, and I tried really hard. Like I wanted so badly to care about and like these characters, and I didn't. And it was just really frustrating.
The way that you just described that makes me think that me in high school would have loved this. Like before
yes.
I had watched enough media to know what tropes that I'm tired of, and to know I don't know, like the things that I was able to pick out now as an adult who has consumed more things and is like more tired of lazy storytelling in these ways, is over it. But if this came out and was, I don't know, I watched all 10 episodes, I would probably have been obsessed with it.
Yes.
So I don't blame people for, like, it makes sense why people enjoy it. I think that's the thing that I want to +1 to that. From your spiel.
And I think also, I mean, something that we've touched on that is different from what Sam had to say is that we didn't have like an emotional in with any of the characters.
Right.
And that's something that I don't know, it's like deeply personal, like who you connect with as a character. I mean, I think there are some things that maybe I could say point more towards like bad writing or like tropes that I don't like or whatnot. But if you find a character that you can really latch onto and have that as an entry point to the story, I can see why you would like this, because then that positive is there to balance out some of the other like tropey things or negative things. But if you don't have that entry point, like it sounds like me and Nicole, maybe Sari didn't have, then this becomes just like a hot mess of like plots where you're like, why do I care? So I don't know, Sam, who was the character or characters that like had that emotional attachment for you?
okay, so I'm just sitting over here as all of you are attacking my kids, and I'm just like, so it's really hard. So yeah, I know that the reason that I do like generally still like this show, even though like I like dissecting it just as much as I liked consuming it, is because of the emotional connection that I had. And I don't know if it was one of those instances of like, I have not binged watched a show in literally years. I had a really rough week. Like, you know, what was it exactly? But
yeah, right. All of the like emotional, personal, whatever. Yeah.
Like I was crying at things that like, I don't know if I was supposed to cry. There's a lot of tears, you know? So I was just using this as like media as an outlet, you know? But it's funny that everybody that I've seen talk about the show, and you guys included, have talked about Ben and Klaus, who I do like a lot. But my favorites are Vanya and Diego. And Diego, I don't want to like, and I don't actually like him as he is. But I like the potential that he has. If they just wouldn't center his character development around the killing of women, like, then I would enjoy him more. And I like his personality, and I like his relationship that builds with Klaus over the whole of the show. So by the end, they're like really close and all of this stuff. And also, I just really liked Vanya's, like, I don't know, I just felt for her, like, being told she's normal and not special, and being, like, beat down when she's a sweet little cinnamon bun, especially at the beginning. So those are the two that I attached to the most, and I also really enjoyed different characters' relationships. Not the incestuous one, but all the other, like the sibling dynamics and the family kind of thing, and the fact that this is like sort of a found family, but also a family that's been forced together and that don't particularly like one another. I liked a lot of that. I liked the sister dynamics. I liked those, like the kind of almost toxic relationships at times. I just found really interesting. So yeah, I like bands of stupid nerds trying their best, and I feel like although they're not really trying their best all the time, I still appreciate watching them mess up a lot. So yeah, my favorites emotionally are Vanya and Diego. I still can't even tell you why Diego exactly, but for some reason I latched on to him. And then I do like Klaus and Ben, and I'm interested to see if in the future Ben will be alive, or if we're going to find out why exactly Ben isn't alive.
That makes sense to me a little bit. Vanya, your choices don't make sense to me. But
listen, in this house we stand Vanya, okay?
Yeah.
So
that was part of my frustration with the show too. Is that like Vanya is clearly meant to be our way in, and I just like couldn't get there. But that being said, I think part of why I had like a slightly different reaction than Sarah or Mari to what I would expect going forward, like why I would be interested in a second season of this show, like maybe not excited about it or like super optimistic, but like would be willing to give it a chance, is that like the ideas, there are a lot of really interesting ideas around like all of the, you know, the baggage that these characters have and so on and so forth, that like you can do interesting things with, like those family dynamics, everything that you are saying, Sam, like I all of that stuff is, I don't know. It's also why it was frustrating for me, because like all of that stuff is why I wanted so badly to like it. Like there were so many levels on which it felt like it should be my shit, and yet it just wasn't. And so that made it kind of frustrating. But I super understand where you're coming from with all of that. I did actually really enjoy the little bits of like sisterly, you know, interaction like that. Those were definitely some of the high moments. The couple sibling relationships that appeared almost functional. So that's Ben and Klaus, and then periodically Vanya and Allison, like little bits where you could see them sort of starting to behave like siblings and like get along in some kind of way. Like there were glimmers of something that I definitely did enjoy those bits.
I think I would have probably had more patience for like this dysfunctional family trying to get their stuff together and, you know, come back together after a time and work out their own stuff, but also their relationships, if there wasn't the added layer of like the time clock and the end of the world. like out of the gate, it's like 8 days till the end of the world. And so I'm like, oh man, here we go. But then you forget about that for a while and it like kind of gets pushed aside and everybody's just like stumbling around their relationships and their powers. And I'm like, guys, we have like 8 days to save the world. And so like those two things
for your drama.
We don't have time for this. Like no more chats about how to be sisters. You're going to be dead. I don't think you understand.
So what you're saying is like you're 5. Like, is what you're saying. You're like, listen, we don't have time. I'm really angry.
Right.
Let's go.
I just think that the story got a little, like from a storytelling perspective, it was a little too jam-packed. Like you didn't have enough time to do the relationship stuff as well, or like the race against the clock as well, because they were trying to do both together.
In addition to the time pressure, I think that also heightened the number of conflicts in each episode and like the amount of like 5 saying that we need to save the world, but everyone was in it for their own interests. And I felt like keeping track of all the different character threads and having them all be pitted against each other most of the time rather than like building sibling relationships, which functionally makes sense because they're adults who haven't talked to each other in a very long time. I have a note that I wrote in episode 3. Everyone is mean. Mean to Vanya about her violin. Mean to Patch about sleeping with Diego. Everyone deals with too much shit. And I felt like that made it harder to sink into my feelings with any one character because everyone was just like tearing each other down, and I didn't have a point of like levity of, okay, we're going to now work together to advance the plot or fix this thing or understand that the world is ending. And like eventually they did. Eventually 5 had more and more people gathered together on his team who were thinking about the big picture things. But I don't know. I'm articulating this extremely poorly, but like the way that the conflicts were structured felt like I didn't know who to care about, and I just wanted something kind and good in this world of very broken people.
They were all such assholes that there's just an element of like, fine, fuck it, let the world end. Like I don't got whatever.
Should we talk about all the problematic tropes that pop up? Because we could talk about that for a while.
We sure could. Who wants to start?
I mean, I feel like I need to so I can defend myself because you guys are like attacking everything.
We're not attacking.
I mean, it's just like, these are my kids. Okay. So when Nicole was talking about like how upset, like how she couldn't attach to the show because of all the problems, like that's also why the problems made me so mad because I'm like, no, I'm pulling for you and you're doing all these things that I really hate. Like, what the hell? Yes. That was really how I started feeling because some of my like least favorite tropes in fiction pop up in this. So the fact that I do like this just proves how emotionally attached I am to it. But like as soon as Patch gets fridged, I'm like, what the fuck? And then as soon as we start seeing this medicine thing, I was like, oh God, she's gonna have this, like, her powers being subdued by mental health medication. And I'm like, God damn it, here it is. So just like the fact that those two popped up back to back for me just sucked. And then just like the overarching, feeling of toxic masculinity that just like prevails throughout the whole show sucks. Like the way that the show treats its female characters in general is just shitty. I was already feeling when Diego like basically killed the mom at the beginning. I'm like, oh no, is this the path we're gonna go down? And then things just kept happening again and again and again. So I was just very like, what is this show doing to its female characters? I think part of the reason too that I like this show is, like you guys have mentioned, even though you don't generally like it as much as I do, or even close to how much that I do, that it has all this potential. So I almost want to like take these characters and like put them somewhere else, you know, like I want to write them better, and I want to do better things with them and not have all the problems. But I know that that's a fantasy that exists in my own head, and that I can't like necessarily rate the show based on that, but it's kind of how I feel.
This show is definitely the kind of thing that like is ripe for a very active fan community that like is doing transformative shit with it. There are pieces here. There's like a really cool sandbox, and then like you like as a fan community can sort of run off and go do other shit with it. Like that is again one of the things that I totally get why this would appeal to people too, for people who enjoy doing that, who get a lot out of doing that from with their media. And I don't know, if I had more time, maybe that would be my reaction to this. I'm not sure. But yeah,
I think that, you mentioned a lot of the tropes that I would mention, but I'm just going to take more time to harp on how much I hated them.
I want to make sure you had your time, which is why I went over them quickly, so I knew that you could pull in and just say all the things you needed to say. So.
Nicole mentioned the lack of using your words, which is a fine thing to do if you want to be lack of communication is the way that we're going to stall the plot. But again, not if you have a time clock to the end of the world. I think that those things don't necessarily gel in a satisfying storytelling way. I understand that you all hate each other, but if the world is ending and you're making that what's pulling your plot forward, to then just have everybody not telling each other things becomes frustrating to me as a viewer. So I hated that. All of the women being killed and the fridging. And by extension, I didn't like that Vanya then becomes she's the most powerful of them, arguably, and she's got this amazing power, but her whole storyline is wrapped up in this manipulation, he's manipulating her, he's poisoning her, and then she gets her power and she goes crazy. What a crazy female she is. That whole plot, I don't know.
He was right to be manipulating her. And,
right.
Yep.
Yes. And I don't know, that whole thread just let me down and was very unsatisfying.
I think to add to the fridging of the female characters, the thing that really weighed me down was just the difference in suffering between especially of the Umbrella Academy, the men and the women. So Vanya is in an abusive relationship basically the whole time. And Allison is also going through a very emotionally intense thing. And then Allison gets her neck slit and has to go through this intense bodily trauma. And Luther and Diego collectively, their man pain is just like Luther got sent to the moon and is sad about the fact that he has no value and is a bad leader. And Diego, like Sam mentioned, a lot of his man pain comes from the death of women around him. His mom, which he killed or deactivated her as a robot, and Patch. And I don't know, Patch was killed. The mom robot was eviscerated. We haven't talked about Hazel and Cha-Cha, really, who are the time agents who are sent to hunt Five. They're part of the organization that he was a part of, where they go through history and assassinate people, which, cool premise, still murder. But even Cha-Cha, who had the potential to be such a cool character, an evil character for sure, because she's an assassin and goes through murdering people. Her plot line was kind of reduced to torturing an old woman that Hazel fell in love with. And she went from this, I don't know, person about business. She has a job, and it is being an assassin, to getting beat up, thrown out of a car, and on this revenge quest that had no real implication for her. Even through that, she was beat up and bloodied and everything, and Hazel was still relatively unscathed. And so just the treatment of women's bodies throughout this. And the fact that Five fell in love with a mannequin and was dragging that around was a weird women as objects, clearly, obviously. And that was episode 2. I think that was the thing that happened, where it was why the hell is Five talking to a mannequin, in all caps in my notes?
Because that's what this show thinks of female bodies.
Yeah.
And then their mother is a robot, right? And it I get I get what the story was trying to do with all of these things, but when you have them all together, the way that we're looking at it as a whole, the way that this show thinks about female bodies, to then have the woman robot styled as 60s housewife, oh, that is so gross. Like, just like that image of like perfection, staying at home, taking care of the kids. And there was even a part where like she gets like thrown against the wall and her head gets like pushed aside and she just gets up and keeps being a mother. And that kind of thing just, I don't know, in addition to everything else that the show is doing, just makes me feel like whoever was writing it or putting it together doesn't have that high of an opinion of women and their agency and their bodies.
That's a really good point too, though, that it's the totality of the thing, that like any of these things by themselves, I think like in a story that was otherwise more thoughtful, like I could overlook them, but it's the fact that like we were able to just run down this whole ass list of examples that make it so, I don't know, just gross.
I think that's probably where a lot of my dislike is coming from too, because I was more nitpicky. As soon as I started noticing things that maybe made me feel uncomfortable, I noticed everything that did. So another example is Klaus's plotline. He's the closest thing to my son of this show. He's not hurting anyone. He's hurting himself. It's very sad. Please get sober. I understand. Seeing dead
his
people.
Trauma, yeah, his trauma like makes
intense.
so much sense. Yeah.
And in case like the trauma of being forced to see dead people by your adoptive father and seeing them screaming at you all the time isn't enough, he's sent back to a war zone, and he gets one happy moment, which is falling in love, and then they, I don't know, bury your gaze. He had one chance at happiness and then fell in love for the first time in his whole life, which they established that he just has flings in the modern day, can't hold down anything more than a week, and goes through this very intense, positive emotional experience and then loses it. And that only adds to his pile of trauma. It's just like, I want to protect him. And maybe in another story where, okay, you're going to really, really beat down on Klaus, but the rest of the story is like very strong and very well balanced, then it's like, oh, this is a minor inconvenience that I have, but I'll forgive it because for me personally, I was really invested in his character development and his growth and his, I don't know, choices to become sober and finding his strength through that and relying on Ben, like his relationship with Ben, as the most consistent, strong relationship in his life, all very interesting to me. But because the barrier gaze trope was on top of all this other violence against women, it's like, oh, now you have violence against queer people too, so I'm mad. Fun.
I think one trope that we briefly mentioned but wasn't on Sam's list, but this is one that I think that
all of mine. I did not list them all.
I know. I'm not. My point was just that I think this is one that is like universally hated. Like I haven't seen anybody say anything positive about Luther and Allison's relationship.
True.
Yeah.
Right.
True.
Why?
I don't know. It is. I'm sorry, they're not blood siblings, but they were raised together. Those are siblings,
Right. Well, especially because the rest of them routinely like refer to each other as siblings. Like, so I don't understand like how Allison's having all these sister bonding moments with Vanya, but Luther's not her brother. Like, nah, he's her brother.
Yep. And they flirt and they kiss and I hate it. And even if they weren't brother and sister, like I hate Luther in general. Right. I think he might be my least favorite.
Yes.
And then so you get to the end where Vanya's recovering from her injury and Luther has put Vanya in a cage, basically. Other great treatment of women. And Allison's trying to tell him, like, no, get her out. And he blocks her physically. And then he takes her to her room and sits by her bed, even though she clearly doesn't want him there.
Literally
and just
pushes him away. Yep.
Yes. And he just sits there and continues to watch over her while she wants nothing to do with him after he's put his other sister in like a cell. That entire sequence of events just that was like the cherry on top of my Luther hate.
And then he doubles down on that in the big finale too, where Allison's like, no, like, let me go in. Like, I can talk to her. Give me one last chance. And like, when she goes away, it's like, yeah, LOL. I just wanted to get her, I'm going to let her be a distraction, and I'm still going to go ahead with my plan.
Yes.
Fuck that guy.
Also, the whole, like, when Allison's like, I need your voice, which I'm like, why are you using Luther?
Yeah.
Like, whatever. But then he uses that talking to her kid to tell her, like, his own feelings. And I'm like, stop!
Yes. About you.
Oh my god, everything is about him and it, like, being sent to the moon, and I'm like, I do not care about you whatsoever. So I think that's one of the reasons I love Diego, because Diego hates Luther as much as I do. Okay? Like, that's why I love Diego, okay? Because Diego manifests all of my hate towards Luther, like, the entire time.
He's the one who's saying all the things that you wish you could say.
I mean, Diego's whole life is like, fuck Luther. Like, I mean, like, anything he can do to make Luther's life harder, he will do. So that's why I'm like, I stand.
Relatable.
I will look up the tweet to give proper credit, but as I try not to like tweet about things that we're going to cover on the podcast because I want to conserve my feelings, but I had so many feelings this time around that I was just like taking it out on Twitter. Somebody called Luther toxic masculinity in a poorly fitted trench coat.
I saw that. It was so
like
good.
The entirety of his character. That is exactly it, and I hated it.
I'm actually so glad, because I was a little bit nervous before I saw you tweeting that you hated him, that you might like him, which I should have known that you wouldn't, because of course you wouldn't. You're better than that. But he also is like completely, like, the show frames him as like he's the good guy, like he's like supposed to be like the hero, and I was like, if Mari likes Luther, we're gonna have problems, and like thankfully you didn't, so it's fine.
The show is clearly giving him good guy edit. Which,
yes. Why? He's the worst. Okay. Ugh.
Yeah, I think that the show did need a good guy in there, as it's going back to what Siri was saying, like having one kind of good non-asshole person as an entry point. And I think it needed a character like what they were trying to do with Vanya, but both of those things just missed for me. Especially because the good guy edit, what they went for was like the alpha hole, right? They're like, a good guy, look at this alpha male. He's super strong and is going to tell you what to do, and he's number one. Nope.
No.
I feel like we have spent the entire time ragging on this show and probably could say a lot more, but I am curious if there were, like, what were some of the things that you did enjoy about this show? If anything, I don't know, Mari, maybe you have nothing. You could sit this round out.
I mean, beyond the character stuff that I mentioned earlier, I really did enjoy, and I don't know a lot about like cinematography, but I did feel like the aesthetics of the show and some of the way certain scenes were shot, like, I did enjoy. So like when all of them were dancing in the first episode and like it pulls back to like a dollhouse view, I really enjoyed stuff like that. They did it again when like they're in the library, like Luther and Diego, I think, are in the library, and they pull it back, like those kinds of things, and the way, and just like the fight scenes with like the music that's not the kind of music that you're typically used to. Although towards the end I was like, okay, we've seen this a ton of times. Like you've done this already. Like, okay. But it did feel like a comic translation when they did those kinds of scenes where I'm like, okay, yeah, I see that you're doing this as a graphic novel adaptation. Cool.
That is 100% like what my answer to this question would have been. Like, that is by far my favorite thing about the show. And I think I got a little bit farther into it than Sari or Mari, and before I like realized that I didn't like it because I was enjoying all of that stuff so much that I watched it before Mari didn't. Like, we were talking about it on Discord, and there's like this gradual creep in my messages to her that were like, wait, this is not good.
Question?
But because I loved all of the visual elements of the show so much from the beginning that like it took a while before the rest of the stuff really ground me down. But I loved all of that.
I really liked the parts of it that felt like the most comic booky to me, so like the superpowers of it. So towards the beginning of the series, you get a fight scene with everyone as kids using their powers to save a bank from some sort of generic terrorist robber, whatever, holding hostages. And that for me was the most excited I was about the show, because you get to see everyone like flexing their super muscles in a way. and you get to see like the things that make the show, I don't know, really fun and unique, because they are interesting powers. Like the fact that Allison's, she has to say, I have a rumor. I would watch a whole origin story figuring out when she, as a small girl, discovers that her power is to, I don't know, change people's wills, because that's incredibly powerful and incredibly hard to stumble upon an exact key phrase in some way. Ben and his tentacles, what happened there? And the little flashbacks that we got to their childhood and the abusive ways that they were being raised, and their powers were forced to come out, or they're forced to hone their powers, not in like a pleasant X-Men training environment. I don't know too much about it, but it seems like, I don't know, that was more of like a home for misfits. Everyone wants to be here, and we're going to train together to help save the world. This was a rich man essentially bought you and is now going to manipulate you to his will because he's curious about what you can do. And then there's some glossy poster of you're going to save the world. And I was fascinated by that because Hargreaves was clearly the enemy in that situation. Like, he treated none of his children correctly. So if it was a show just about, like, strip away that the world is ending, catastrophe, and if it's a show about adults coming to terms with the fact that they were abused as children, and now that they have these powers and they don't know what to do with them because they were superheroes and now they're not, I would probably love that show, honestly.
That is part of why I would be interested in season 2, just based on the way that season 1 ended. There's a part of me that feels like then the narrative for season 2 is like adults going back and like trying to rectify the abuse of their childhood. I guess, like, I don't know what else go back and fix Vanya means, besides like make her not be abused throughout her childhood. So like there's that element of it that I find interesting, but I totally agree with everything else that you said.
My positive is just, I had the same thing as Sari, basically. It reminded me a lot of how I felt when we were watching Cloak and Dagger, and how their powers were also really unconventional, and it felt like something I hadn't seen before. And, you know, everything that they did there, like every little piece of their power that we then got to know about felt like something fresh and was really interesting. And so that piece of it, concept-wise, I do really like that these are, you know, non-traditional powers. And I keep thinking about like the 30-something children out there that were also born on this day.
Right.
And you got to figure that some of them also have powers. So it's like some of the stuff that's at the edges of the story that I think are really interesting, that we didn't get to see much of in this season. But like as a concept, I did like the powers. And as far as like the visuals and everything, every time that the title sequence, like the Umbrella Academy on
Yes.
like, I thought that was like
Loved.
really, really neat. Loved it as well. So yay, positive.
Yeah, when you guys were talking about the whole powers thing, that reminded me how, and I wouldn't necessarily consider this a positive or a negative, but the world is intriguing to me because but it also annoys me because I can't quite figure it out. Just the fact that there's like technology, like somebody I think on Twitter called it like alt tech, which I wasn't familiar with before, but you know, basically like it's almost like another dimension of our reality that doesn't have the same technology though it's the same time of, you know, it's still 2019. But just the fact that there like isn't really like computers and cell phones and stuff like that. But one thing that I found interesting when you guys kind of brought up X-Men, was it seems like people like knew about the Umbrella Academy, but they weren't like the celebrity status that like X-Men or like some of the other superheroes and other comics are. Like people were just like, okay, like they had that little following, but again, not to the extreme that like you see in X-Men and some of those things. And people don't seem to like really love them or hate them. And the weird things that happen in the world, people just kind of like accept. Like it seems like people just accepted that all these kids were born and like that some of them had powers and that this guy like, and it was just like, it's fine. So I find that interesting because I'm like, okay, I want to know more about like why people are like, oh, people are disappearing on the streets, or, you know, Klaus disappears in front of everyone and the girl's just like, okay, you know, like happens all the time, you know, like, so
Right.
That I find kind of like interesting, but again, not in a positive or negative way. It's just one thing that I'm like, I kind of want to know a little more about that.
To me, there were a lot of things like that were like bordering on negative because I couldn't tell if it was we are not exploring this yet, or we don't have time or space to explore it, or if it was an underdeveloped world. So all of the time travel stuff was a little like, I don't want to know specifically. I don't know enough to really understand if you're going to like posit time travel theory at me. But even if it's like a Doctor Who timey-wimey thing, like wibbly, just give me some idea, because it seemed like time is linear in this show because they keep jumping back and fixing things. But there were some other like time travel things they don't specify. And so a lot of that like myth and world building was just kind of left to like shrug, like, I don't know, like we don't really need to talk about it right now. But I think it did leave some things a little hazy for me.
For me, this feels like a quintessential like rookie comic thing to do. So we haven't talked about really its origins. Gerard Way wrote it of... Oh, is he My Chemical Romance? I don't know. I'm the worst person to explain this. I don't know what I'm talking about. I actually have no idea. I just like did not. That was the pop culture that I ignored completely growing up. So he wrote this. Gabriel Ba, I think, has illustrated. He's like been in comics for a while, and he has a really great illustration style. But it seems like a story that Gerard Way had in his brain of like, this would be cool, and this would be cool, and this would be awesome, and this would look like, what if a time agency existed where the key to their time travel was their briefcases, so they'd look sharp in suits, and then they'd have these pneumatic tube systems, and it'd be like an office, but assassins. And then thinking of these really visual powers, like tentacles popping out of someone, or like the whisper of a rumor or something like that, and these really elaborate, beautiful fight scenes. But not fleshing it out beyond that. So like the things that you just said, Sam and Mari, make me think that maybe he didn't have an answer to it and just added them in because he could add a cool visual element to the story and wanted to flesh out the world, but wasn't, I don't know, a practiced author who was well-versed in world building. And so what you see in the show or on the page is all that exists of it. And so if you're used to pulling apart stories and kind of like peeking behind the curtain or wanting to know more or wanting to know how things are followed through or what their continuity is or what the fact that the Umbrella Academy was famous as children actually means, he might not have an answer to that, and that shows when you ask those questions. But if you were just to watch the show and enjoy it visually and not think about those things beyond that, then I don't know, you'd have a great time.
Yeah, I also think you bring up Gerard Way's interesting too, because I knew My Chemical Romance, I liked My Chemical Romance, but I wasn't like in the scene necessarily. I was listening to like Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco, but like the fact that Gerard Way, who was at the center of like the emo scene back in the day, and what that all stood for, I think is interesting as well with a lot of things we've been talking about, because there is a lot of this imagery involved with like that scene. I know Gerard Way was involved with a lot of the very visual music videos, which again, you create this like little world and then like no one asks you about it. There's no follow-up questions and it's fine. Right. But like My Chemical Romance was known for like their music videos, and he had a huge part in that. And he, the whole emo scene was very visual, and there was also a lot of like problematic elements to a lot of the themes in emo music, especially related to kind of like women and some of the toxic masculinity that was sort of hidden within that scene. We can go all into this. This was a lot of my high school time. I think it's interesting that it is Gerard Way. And if you think about it being written by somebody who was at like the forefront of the emo scene back in the day, I think that kind of points to where some of these issues originated.
There are some interesting interviews with Gerard Way and articles that I kind of glanced through a couple of them, but he talks a lot about how Luther in particular represents some of his experience, specifically with body image, So, just that kind of idea of like Luther kind of being disgusted with himself and that whole thing. But also, if you really think about who Luther is as a character, for the author of this world to like most relate to him, I think is very telling as well. So yeah.
That makes the whole like club arc of Luther's story even weirder to me. Like the fact that, oh, he just got drunk and then he went to a rave and took drugs. And then, don't worry, even with his gorilla body, he got laid. It's just like,
Yeah.
I don't like that. It makes sense with that, like with that additional context of if the author identified with that character, of course you'd want some resolution to his body image problems. But in like the grand scheme of the show, Luther's body image problems are inconsequential. Right. Don't give a shit. He doesn't, whatever.
The fact that Gerard Way like relates the most to Luther just makes me so uncomfortable. Like,
yes.
It's just like of all of them, but it also shows through like, and I don't know how much they changed from the show to the comic and everything. Like, I don't know, what the show added in that wasn't there before, but I mean, that Luther was never a good character, and the fact that that's the one that you really like, come on. It just makes me it's so squicky.
Speaking of feeling squicky, Sam, you mentioned it on your list, but we didn't stop here, so I just want to make sure that everybody knows how much I also disliked Vanya's part of her story where she stops taking her medication.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
And then
thank you for circling back.
So the entire the premise really is that her father is basically, as part of his child abuse, is basically drugging her to suppress her powers. And I understand that, but this is one of those things that in totality, in context, this is a trope that you often see where you stop taking your medication. And specifically, not only does she get her powers back, but it's she stops taking her medication, and it's as a bit of creativity that comes back, right? She she's playing the violin so much better, right? So that whole trope of the artist off their meds, I think, is the angle of it that really, really bothered me. And then it's just highlighted by these little things, all of a sudden her ponytail is gone and she's wearing her hair down. And I'm just I hate you. Why are you doing this? Leave ponytails alone, damn it.
I thought you liked a makeover scene.
Not this way. Not this way. Not when it's tied to mental health and medication. It's fine.
No, that made me I got really mad at that whole thing too, because she's taking, I think she mentions that it's anxiety medicine, and I'm somebody that takes anxiety medicine. I took some earlier today. So the fact that it's that, I was very pissed off about it. And I tried to think of how they could have done that differently, but and this is not excusing it because I think they could have just not done it. But I'm also even if they changed it to some other kind of disability, it still would have been shitty. There's still, if it was a physical thing, if it was a mental thing, there was no way to do that particularly well. So I'm just why did you do this? But yeah, the whole, as soon as she was popping pills, at first I was okay, ooh, she has anxiety, I can relate to her, awesome. And then as we start seeing that he's getting rid of her meds and now she's playing, that's when I started just getting really mad. And also when we're talking about the whole transformation thing, I get that her eyes changed color, but where did the smoky eye come from? When did she apply that? Did Gerard Way help her apply that? I'm just not certain how that happened exactly. I'm really a big fan of her menswear transformation because also in my head, in the fandom space, Vanya, super not straight. So the fact that that just came from Ellen Page's closet.
100%.
Yeah, I'm super happy with that. But I'm where did the smoky eye come from? That would have taken some time.
The other thing about the anxiety meds too is that it created a dynamic in which her anxiety was fake. That's what it is. She's on anti-anxiety medications, and basically the show is saying that this actual condition that people are actually medicated for is fake, and wow, what the fuck?
Yeah. When talking about the anxiety medicine, it made me think of the boyfriends who I'm just forgetting. Leonard? Was it Leonard? I don't even remember his name. Okay. I feel there was a whole bunch of buildup with him and the eye and all this stuff. And then it's just he dies real quick. And I wasn't mad about it because I'm this dude sucks. But also I just felt the whole, his whole character is fairly weak because even though the show tries really hard at the beginning to be look at how pure this is. And they play the music that's it's all cute. I'm from the beginning, as soon as that dude walked in, I'm something's up with that dude. Dude, that dude is using her. This is weird. So the fact that they built him up as this, like, it sort of reminded me of the villain in The Incredibles, like, where he's like, you didn't let me be one of you and I'm mad now.
Yep.
It just was like for no reason. I'm like, okay, like, why though? Like, why do we have to abuse our female characters? Because that whole stuff with like all the abuse that he did was just like, it made me uncomfortable again, because it's like, wow, this happens in like real life and these are the exact things that are said to women and like, bleh. But then he just like, the whole eye thing was for nothing. I mean, there's multiple episodes where Five is trying to find this eye and then it's just like, oh wait, JK. Like, and we never even know why Luther had the eye in the first place. Like, in that timeline, did he survive enough to get his eye ripped out? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah.
I'm confused. Yeah. I'm confused.
I feel like any woman from 2019 who has ever interacted with a man saw Leonard and was like, nope, something's wrong there.
You can't fool me with your like nice happy music in the background.
Nope. We knew right away. But yeah, I understand that, like, well, I guess the whole thing was like they were trying to stop or get rid of Leonard because they thought whoever had the eye was the cause of the apocalypse or whatever. But the reason that they really had to protect Leonard instead of stopping him was somehow that if Leonard survived, Vanya would have been okay. I don't know. Like that I don't know what kind of train of thought that they were following, or that just seemed like a plot hole to me because I did not understand how any of that happened. And then by the end, you're just getting like the moon exploding. And I was like, you know what? I don't care. It's over.
The other thing about the Leonard plot being unresolved that was so frustrating for me was because like the amount and the multiple kinds of abuse that he layered onto Vanya, I feel like if the show was careful in a way that it is most obviously not, it could have like shown the effect on her, and it could have shown like the story of a woman who was lured into an abusive relationship, lured into thinking that she was only special because this one man thought she was special, and then coming into her own in some way. And like having a slow realization and extracting her from that situation. And then you could build on her relationship with Allison and like her realizing, because when you're in an abusive relationship, you don't always realize how shitty it is. And that could have been like a very interesting and very powerful thing. And the fact that it ended by her going into a rage because of the ways that he manipulated her and she was out of control of her powers and just killed him. Like quickly and suddenly, and all of a sudden it felt like, woo, the bad guy's dead, but also she has all this even more unresolved trauma now because of it. And so it wasn't a satisfying way. It wasn't a satisfying ending to that arc, because now everyone's focus is off of him and everyone's focus is off of what he did to her.
And you're not going to deal with any of that.
Yeah. It's like you should, if you're going to spend that much of a season showing him abusing her, you better deal with that. You better like be ready to spend the time and space to deal with that. But clearly the show is not. Or season 2, who knows? I don't know when they're going to jump back to.
No.
Leonard. Agreed. Yeah, I think as we're talking about it, it was just another example. I think that was another example of the whole forced timeline that Mari was bringing up earlier, where it was just like, well, we have to get rid of him because we're out of time. Like, and also the fact that like, they're in love and she loves him, but like they've known each other for like 4 days. So that whole thing was just very like, yes, she was in an abusive relationship, but also like for a week, like, and not to say that didn't
That's
like,
true.
that it discredits it, but it's also like, really, I don't really believe that he was pulling all of that out of her and like his abuse was what necessarily set her off. Like, it doesn't really even make that whole thing that they were trying to kind of pull believable either. Cause it's like, they've known each other really for like less than 8 days, because really they weren't even super friendly romantically until day 3. So it's still like, there's really the whole time where you feel like more time has passed than actually has passed. And the show is like not super clear and makes you feel like more time has passed than actually has, is all where things get very muddled and messy.
That's a great place.
Muddled and messy is a good synopsis for the whole
Muddled
show.
and messy. Fiend.
And on that muddled and messy note, we are going to end this episode of the podcast. Thank you so much to Sam and Sari for joining us again. If you are enjoying this podcast, we would greatly appreciate it if you joined our community on Patreon, where we've got some bonus content and polls to vote on future media, and you can join our Discord. You can find out more at patreon.com/SnarkSquad. We would love to hear all of your thoughts on the Umbrella Academy. You can find a post dedicated to this episode as well as any show notes at SnarkSquad.com, or you can find us on Twitter at Snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says.
You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I'm at C.E. Riley.
And I'm at Thoughts on Tomes.
Thank you, as always, to Stefan Chin for the delightful theme music that is playing us out right now, and we will be back in your podcast feed again next week. Bye!
Bye.